I feel that it is important for you to understand the background of what's happening in Gaza and the reality of the living conditions of the Palestinian people who are trapped there, who are unable to leave despite being told to leave by the Netanyahu regime. I want us to really take in consideration not only their living conditions, but who they are. These 2.2 million people, where nearly 50% of them are under the age of 18. This audio is prepared and provided by means.tv.
Gaza Strip is only 25 miles long and about 5 miles wide. 2 million Palestinians live packed into this tiny space, one of the most densely populated places in the world. Half are children. Many live in refugee camps speckled throughout the besieged territory. A stunning 80% of the population relies on foreign aid. Aptly called an open-air prison, there are only 2 ways to leave the enclosed area: the Erez crossing into Israeli territory and the Rafah crossing, which goes to Egypt. Both are completely controlled by hostile militaries. What Israel calls a border is actually a heavily militarized perimeter fence comprised of barbed wire, surveillance networks, and lethal no-go zones. If you roam too close to the so-called no-go zone, which extends 300 meters out from the fence, Israeli forces have authorized themselves to shoot to kill. Thousands of unarmed Palestinians have been shot for violating this rule in 2018 alone. The same goes for Gaza's coastline. It is the only place in the world where you can't even flee by boat, as refugees elsewhere often do. Fishermen are restricted to only a few nautical miles from their shore. Straying past that, even by accident, you can be blown out of the water by Israeli warships. A massive seawall in the north and south, currently being extended, boxes them into their small sliver of sea. This violence is compounded by an economic blockade that imposes a chokehold of poverty on Gaza, resulting in one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, according to the World Bank. 70% of the youth are unemployed, with 52% for the general population.
Now, before I go any further, I think it's important that I make a few statements and make them extremely clear. Hamas is not Palestine. Palestine is greater than Hamas. In fact, Hamas has been guilty of some of the most brutal oppression of the Palestinian people, and their actions have led to thousands of Palestinians being slaughtered because of the decisions of Hamas. Hamas is not Palestine. Hamas is made up of young Palestinian men who have grown up underneath the conditions that you just heard. Hamas is made up of young Palestinian men who have seen their brothers, their mothers, their sisters, their fathers be treated like the very animals that Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called them. They are a people who have been underneath occupation for years. Entire families have grown up underneath this occupation and these brutal conditions. And so, yes, it is a ripe ground for recruiting people who will engage in the extremism that we saw this weekend. But you cannot look at what happened this weekend and take it out of context of the conditions imposed upon the Palestinian people by the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Here is Mehdi Hassan of MSNBC explaining the conditions of the average Palestinian.
Because what happened in Israel was horrific, deadly, heartbreaking, and the Israeli government is obviously going to retaliate, as you mentioned there. There have already been retaliatory airstrikes, but there's talk of escalation, of a ground invasion, of exacting a price. And you have to understand, when we talk about Gaza in the West, for a lot of people, it's very easy to conflate Hamas, which is a militant group that carries out acts of vicious terror, as they did this weekend, with Gaza, which is a place that contains 2.2 million people, Alex, half of them children. Half of the 2.2 million people are children, and it's one of the most densely populated places on planet Earth. You've got 2.2 million people crowded into 141 square miles. So they automatically become the victims of Israeli airstrikes because it's so crowded, because it's so densely populated. And it's basically like living, Alex, in an open-air prison. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of the former head of Israeli intelligence just a few months ago, Tamir Pardo. He said, "We're treating Gaza like an open-air prison." So that is the context that is so important for us to remember when we talk about Gaza as some kind of, strange, faraway place, people shouting with guns. It's actually a real place with real people, families, and they're living in horrific conditions, Alex. 59% of Gazans live in poverty, 63% food insecure, 70% of young people unemployed, 90% of Gazans have no access to clean drinking water. The UN Secretary General called it hell on earth. How much more hellish is it going to get in the coming days?
Well, if history is any indicator, Mehdi, it's getting ready to get a lot more hellish for the Palestinian people. The asymmetrical nature of the conflict between Israel and Palestine is best evidenced by the number of people who were killed in retaliation by Israel on Palestine. And I think one of the most starkest contrasts would be the 2018 conflict, where you have 130 Israelis who died in the conflict compared to 31,558 Palestinians who died in the conflict. In 2019, 133 were killed on the Israeli side. 15,628 were killed on the Palestinian side. Go back in time to 2014, 2,796 Israelis were killed compared to the 19,860 Palestinians who died. We can see throughout history that when Israel strikes back, they strike with a disproportionate amount of force that obliterates the Palestinian people, creating the next generation of recruits for militant organizations like Hamas. And so the question that I have is for people like Benjamin Netanyahu and people like Ben Shapiro, the American commentator of Jewish descent, who is actively online inflaming this situation, disregarding the lives of Palestinians. My question for them is, how many Palestinians have to die this time? And what's usually frustrating about these conversations is the follow-up question that is always asked: doesn't Israel have the right to protect itself? Even as Israel has a right to defend itself, the question is, when is enough enough? At what point have you taken enough lives to satisfy your retaliation ratio, or what I call the revenge ratio? What is the number, Ben Shapiro or Benjamin Netanyahu? How many Palestinian children have to die? If we look at a different number, the numbers that I just gave you were combatants, but I want you to take in consideration the number of children and civilians who have died in several operations, showing a very stark and a very dark revenge ratio. In the conflict in 2008 and 2009, approximately 3 Israeli civilians were killed. 295 Palestinian civilians were killed. That's a 98-to-1 ratio. In 2014, 6 Israeli civilians were killed. 1,462 Palestinian civilians were killed. That's a 244-to-1 ratio. In 2021, in the May conflict, 2 Israeli civilians were killed for 65 Palestinian civilians. That's a 32.5-to-1 ratio. I'm wondering, what will the ratio be when this conflict is over? How many Palestinians will die, both as a result of the actions of Hamas, as well as the revenge ratio that is exacted from Palestinians by the Israeli government every single time they have a conflict, and they have a conflict almost every year. And if you want to understand why half of their 2.2 million population are children, that's because of how many military-age young men are killed in each of these operations.